There's an outline that you all have. It looks like this. When Zell Dudley in Scott's Shreveport office asked me to do this talk, she asked me to talk about incentives in general, and so I wrote this outline. I didn't write this outline specifically, but I adapted this outline from one that I've used before to talk about Industrial Development Board incentives and industrial development boards. But after the session this morning in Shreveport, I'm going to focus a little bit more on just payments in lieu of taxes, because I think most of y'all are here to hear about that. And I'd like to give you some background about pilots, how they work, a little bit of background about how they evolved, because I think it's important to understand where they came from in order to really appreciate and understand why and how they're structured today. I think that historical background is important. As Scott said, I am from New Orleans. I'm an attorney. I work at Adams and Reese, and I've been doing public finance law in Louisiana since 1982. And even as far back as 1982, I represented the Ouachita Parish Industrial Development Board. So I've been coming up to Monroe for a really long time. I was talking beforehand about how hard it is to travel these days, and back in '82, I sort of divide my career into different segments depending on which airlines were available to fly back and forth. So that was the Royale era. Some of y'all might remember way back then, when sometimes you had to help the pilots load the bags before the flight took off. But anyway, the Industrial Development Board, even in 1982, was doing pilots. It was a different form than it is now, and they were done for different reasons. But the story of today's pilots really begins back in 1982 and even before that. And if you'll flip to page 6 of the outline, I'm going to skip over the first part having to do with tax-exempt bonds. We can go back to that if there's time at the end, but I doubt that there will be. Pilots, it's an acronym. It stands for Payment in Lieu of Taxes. And the way it evolved originally was in connection with what was then called industrial revenue bond financing. And that's what the Ouachita Parish IDB was doing a lot of in the early 80s when I started coming up here. But this kind of financing really started back in the 1950s and 60s when local governments around the country started taking the position that economic development and job creation was a public purpose that was as important as streets and public schools and public buildings and so forth. And so a type of bond issue evolved where a local government would issue general obligation bonds payable from property taxes, and use the proceeds of the bonds to build an industrial building that they would then lease to a private company for the purpose of enticing that company to come into their community or to stay in the community. So it was both an incentive and a business retention tool. Those bonds were payable from property taxes, but they were also payable from payments that the companies would make to these cities and counties and parishes through the lease that they would have on the building. So the bonds would be issued, the proceeds used to build an industrial plant, that would be leased to the company. The company would pay rent to the issuer, and the issuer would use the rent payments to pay the bonds off. And they only resorted to the property taxes if there was a shortfall or a default. As time went on, investors realized that really the taxes were never touched, that the lease payments made by the company were really the sole security for the repayment of the bonds. And so cities stopped issuing the bonds that were payable from taxes and simply started issuing industrial revenue bonds that would be payable solely from lease payments that were made by the companies. So they issued bonds to build a facility for a company, leased it to the company, used the lease payments to pay the debt service on the bonds. And the investors looked through the city and realized that the lease payments were really the source of security, and that was the credit analysis that they were making. One of the unintended consequences of that structure was having to do with the local property taxes that would be collected on that property. because the structure involved public ownership of the plant that was then leased to the company, the plant, being publicly owned, was exempt from local property tax. It was never really intended in these kinds of situations that the company would also be getting a break on their property taxes, because the bonds that were being sold to finance these were tax-exempt bonds. So companies were enjoying a benefit from the lower interest rate. So rather than giving the companies a break on their property tax in addition to the lower interest rate, the idea of a contractual payment in lieu of taxes evolved. And so anytime one of these bonds was done, there'd be a separate agreement where the company would agree to make a payment, a contractual payment, in lieu of taxes, equivalent to the amount of taxes that would otherwise have been paid on the property if it had been privately owned. That pilot would be paid annually to the tax collector, who would distribute it to the taxing bodies just as if it were a tax payment. So the school board would get some, the city would get some, the parish would get some, whatever fire districts, water districts, recreation districts, port commissions would all share in that just as they would get the tax payment. Eventually, Congress did away with tax-exempt bonds for most kinds of private entities. And so these industrial development boards started casting around for another way to use their authority to provide incentives. And this is where the type of pilot that we see today was really born. Whereas in the original scenario, the incentives that these IDBs were giving private companies was in the form of tax-exempt bonds, so they were getting a lower interest rate, a lower cost of capital. When that was done away with by Congress, the IDBs began looking at the pilots as a way to provide the same incentive. So where a company could conceivably save, say, $250,000 a year in interest through the use of tax-exempt bonds, which now are no longer available, a pilot could be structured in some cases where they would save the same amount, $250,000, but it would be on their taxes rather than on their cost of capital. So the companies didn't care whether they were saving $250,000 of interest or $250,000 of taxes. And since the interest savings was no longer available due to changes in the IRS code by Congress, the pilot became the way that IDBs were giving these incentives. So what we started doing was negotiating structured pilot payments. We started taking these contracts that originally said, I, the company, will pay to the sheriff every year an amount equal to the taxes that we otherwise would have paid. And instead we said, I, the company, will make a payment in lieu of taxes to the sheriff each year, but it's going to be a lesser amount than what I would have paid otherwise. And that is the sort of modern pilot incentive that we see today. How does that work exactly? If you flip to page 8 in the outline, there's a table here that's a kind of a generic example of how one of these pilots might be structured to provide an incentive to a company. This table illustrates a situation where a company is making a $25 million investment in a jurisdiction that has a combined tax rate of 100 mils. So on a $25 million investment in Louisiana, commercial property is assessed for tax purposes at 15% of its fair market value. This is a little bit of a oversimplification, but just for purposes of illustration. If they spent $25 million, the assessment would be roughly 15%, or $3,750,000. That equates to $3,750 per mil of taxes. So the taxable assessed value divided by 1,000 is the cost per mil. So at 100 mils, their tax bill would be $375,000. So in this scenario, it's assumed that the land that this development was built on was already on the rolls paying $5,000 a year in taxes. So in this scenario, if you see in year 2015 and 2016, which is the construction period, they continue to pay the amount of taxes that were being paid on that undeveloped land before. So every taxing body that was receiving money before would continue to receive the same amount as they would before the construction. But upon completion, in this example, the company agreed to pay 10% of the amount of taxes they otherwise would have paid, $37,500. So that's a 90% reduction in taxes the first year. That's the incentive. In this example, the pilot was negotiated as a structured stream of payments over 10 years that would increase 5% a year for a few years, then 10%. Anyway, as you can see, it gradually grows over the 10 years until at the end of the term they're paying the full amount of taxes. And at that point in year 11, the pilot would be unwound and the property would go back on the tax rolls. So in this example, the difference in each year between $375,000 and the number you see here in the second to last column, this is how much the company saves as a result of this arrangement. So this is the incentive for them to build their project. There's nothing magic about this table. The arrangement could have run for 5 years, or 15 years, or 25 years, or 40 years, depending on the kind of project it is and what the company needed as an incentive in order to build it. It didn't need to start at 10%. It could have started at 5% or 50%. My point is that in structuring these pilots, there's no model that has to be followed. The number of years and the way that it's structured is tailored to the purposes that are trying to be achieved. So how is this pilot actually implemented? In Louisiana, there is no mechanism by which local governments or industrial development boards can, on their own initiative, grant property tax exemptions. The only property that can be exempt in Louisiana is property that is listed in the Constitution as being eligible for exemption. That is publicly owned property, homestead exempt property, and other types of property specifically enumerated. There's nothing in the Constitution that says that you can exempt property, commercial or industrial property, just as an economic development incentive. And we know that more clearly today than we did a year ago because there's been some litigation that resulted in that finding. However, the laws that relate to industrial development boards and other types of economic development entities state that property owned by those entities is exempt by law because those entities are deemed to be performing a public purpose. These are governmental or quasi-governmental entities, so their property can be exempt under the Constitution. But what it requires is ownership by that public entity in order for the property tax exemption to be available. So in order to structure a pilot, the first thing we have to do is get ownership or title of this property into the name of a public entity. That could be an industrial development board, it could be a parish or city, although we don't do it that way very often. It could be a port commission, it could be an economic development district if there's one available. It just has to be some type of a governmental entity whose property by law is exempt from property tax and which also has the authority by law to own this type of property. So you couldn't take, for example, a fire protection district, which is authorized to provide fire protection, and turn them into an economic development agency. They just don't have the authority under state law to do that. So once you've identified an entity that can sponsor a pilot like this, like an industrial development board, for example, and that's the example I'll use because that's what we see most commonly. The company that's asked for this benefit sells its property, sells its development, it's the land and the building, to the Industrial Development Board. The property is now owned publicly and it's exempt from property tax. The Industrial Board simultaneously leases the property back to the company. So it's a simultaneous sale and lease back, all at the same time, at the same table, and one is recorded and the sale is recorded, and 1 minute later the lease is recorded. The lease agreement will contain provisions that set out the structure of the payment in lieu of tax that's been negotiated in connection with this arrangement. And it might be, for example, a table that looks just like this table on page 8, where under the pilot lease, the company agrees to make lease payments equal to the second to last column annual pilot payment. These are the lease payments that they pay to the industrial board. The industrial board turns around and pays this money over to the sheriff, who distributes it as if it were tax to the taxing bodies in proportion to their various millage rates. So by that mechanism, the company has saved, in this case, the difference each year between $375,000 and this amount. So the important thing that's required for this is public ownership, and that requires transferring the property over to a public body, which then leases it back. Now, under the terms of this lease, the company is responsible for all of the maintenance expense, the upkeep, the insurance. They indemnify the Industrial Development Board against anybody getting hurt on the property. The property, even though it's owned by the IDB, is really treated as if it's the property of the company. And the company has an option to purchase this property back, or purchase their property back at the end of the pilot for a nominal amount, usually about $1,000. So this lease is a capital lease, and under federal tax laws, the company gets the benefits of ownership, even though they don't actually own the property, primarily depreciation under this lease. But for local tax purposes, because it's owned by a tax-exempt entity, it is considered exempt property and no local property taxes attached. That's a lot easier than what the state used to be able to do. I mean, that's a lot harder than what the state used to be able to do with the Industrial Tax Exemption Program, the ITEP, where a company would simply go to Baton Rouge, make an application to the Board of Commerce and Industry if it was a manufacturing facility, and get a 10-year property tax exemption just by the stroke of a pen. There was no need to transfer the title. There was no need to meet any sort of jobs goals or anything like that. As long as the project met the state's criteria and it was approved by the board, they would get a 5-year tax exemption with a nearly automatic 5-year extension after that. So that's the 10-year ITEP program that you all have heard about. The state could do that because that program, without transferring title to a public body, because that program is in the Constitution. But there's no similar program that provides, that can be done by local governments where the tax exemption is in the Constitution. So that's why, to achieve the same end locally, we have to resort to this much more complicated structure of transferring title from the company to a sponsoring entity like the Industrial Development Board, which then leases the property back. Now, if you'd flip to page 6, I want to run through, because I think this is probably the part that's going to be most interesting to you all, some of the different scenarios and reasons that pilots are used. But before I do that, does anybody have any questions about what I've covered so far? Just the basics of how pilots are structured and anything that I've talked about up till now. Scott.
David, can you talk about the police jury appoints the Industrial Development Board here in Washington Parish? Is there some insulation as far as from a liability standpoint by having that Industrial Development Board separate insulation from liability, if you will?
Yep. Industrial development boards, which I mentioned as one of the types of entities that can do these pilots, are a special kind of a governmental organization that's authorized by state law in Louisiana and in other states. In Louisiana, industrial development boards, they're not political subdivisions. They have no taxing authority. IDBs in Louisiana are nonprofit corporations. They're public corporations, but they're nonprofit corporations. They are incorporated by incorporators, by individuals, with the permission of a parish or municipality. So 3 individuals would go to, say, the Ouachita Parish Police Jury, as they did back in the 1970s, and ask permission to incorporate an industrial development board that would have parish-wide jurisdiction. Once they incorporate the board, the police jury appoints the board of directors, or the city council if it's created by a city. So even though the IDB is a separate entity and is independent of the parish or the city, They're somewhat accountable because the board of directors is appointed by the parish or city governing authority. Nevertheless, they are a separate entity with separate books, separate board of directors, completely separate legal entity. By doing that, one of the reasons that industrial development boards started to be used going back to the 60s and 70s instead of police juries and cities issuing these bonds directly was the idea that by putting ownership in an of a plant, say in the name of an industrial development board instead of in the name of a police jury, it sort of distanced the government itself from any liability that might arise. So the IDB, because it's a separate entity, does have a side purpose of insulating the parish or city that created it somewhat from the liability that would exist from owning the property. But that's not the primary reason for doing that. Really, the primary reason was just to have it as a separate entity that wouldn't necessarily be as political. I think the insulation was important, but maybe not the main reason for doing it. But the main thing to keep in mind is it's a separate entity, although its members are appointed, and through that appointment process, they're somewhat accountable to the parish or to the city that created them. And only parishes and cities can create industrial boards in Louisiana. So this isn't something that a school board could do or anything like that. However, there are a couple of cases where parishes have created IDBs that have less than parish-wide jurisdiction. So for example, there's an IDB in Richland Parish that has jurisdiction just in one ward of Richland Parish. There's another similar IDB in Washington Parish, I know, that has jurisdiction in one ward. But most of the time, they'll have jurisdiction parish-wide or city-wide, depending on who created them. Okay, so some examples of the different scenarios where pilots could be used. The bottom of page 6. The first one, which is the original one, is purely to provide a property tax abatement as an incentive to attract or retain business. This was the original purpose of tax-exempt bonds and pilots. It was to provide a financial incentive to either bring in a new business or retain an existing business by reducing the cost of their capital project, either by reducing the interest rate on their financing using tax-exempt bonds or reducing the annual tax payment through the use of a pilot. So that's the traditional method, and it's still an important reason for looking at pilots. Other states have similar arrangements. Other states have other kinds of economic development programs that Louisiana can't match. So sometimes the pilot is the only thing that a local government can do as an incentive to compete with, say, Texas or Mississippi or other states, because of the fact that we have a very limited number of incentives that can be offered in Louisiana. Other times the pilot is done as an incentive to retain business. And the one that Scott alluded to earlier that was approved earlier this year here in Washita Parish for GPI was kind of a retention pilot. They were looking at other sites for their expansion project. They have an existing plant here, as you all know, that's a very important taxpayer and big employer, and they wanted to stay here, and of course everyone in Washita Parish very much wants them to stay here. So the pilot was an incentive to help them make the decision to stay and to continue to grow the plant here instead of putting their growth dollars in some different location. And that was an important incentive, and it did serve to keep them here and direct the future capital investment to the plant in Monroe. They were also getting, as a matter of routine, a property tax abatement from the state under the 10-year program, and when that program got more difficult, as Scott mentioned last year, and was pretty much unavailable to them going forward, they really needed to replace that, because that was something that they had sort of now built into their system. That there would be 10 years of an abatement of property tax was something that they came to expect almost as a matter of right. And so when that was no longer available from the state, the locals needed to find a way to provide that continued incentive to them to stay here and continue to grow that plant. The second, integrated with the 10-year ITEP program to provide a longer period of tax reduction and abatement. And the next one as well, on the top of the next page, used in lieu of the ITEP program to provide a longer incentive period. If you'd flip to the very back of this handout, the last page, and look at that chart with me, this illustrates these two scenarios, really the second one more than the first. But in the middle columns of this table, and this is the same scenario as the one that I was discussing a few minutes ago, a company that's spending $25 million in a new plant in a parish that's got a tax rate of 100 mils. If they had previously gone to Baton Rouge and been awarded a 10-year ITEP, these two columns in the middle would have reflected their payments. For 10 years, they would have paid nothing. Complete 100% abatement from local property taxes. And then beginning in year 11, for the next 10 years, they would have paid the full amount of taxes. And again, this is oversimplified a little bit, but it's assuming that the taxes in year 11 would be the same as the taxes in year 1. And of course, it's not as easy as that. There's depreciation, there's other changes that take place, and millage rates. But for purposes of illustration, I'm showing a complete abatement for 10 years, and then 10 years of paying $375,000 a year. Well, this is great for the company. They get this wonderful window of 10 years where they pay no property taxes, but not so great for the local taxing bodies who are having to provide more services as projects grow or new projects come in. If a plant opens that generates a lot of new jobs, you may have people moving into the parish who send their kids to public schools, buy additional home construction that requires utilities, fire protection, police protection, everything. The cost of government increases as these things increase. The plant itself sometimes puts additional demands on local utility systems, fire protection, and so forth. And with this 10-year ITEP, there's no tax money coming in for the first 10 years. So as an alternative to this arrangement, industrial boards have offered what's illustrated basically in the last two columns to companies as an alternative to the 10-year ITEP. If you look at the third column from the end, before I get to the last one, if you take the present value of this company's payments over 20 years in this scenario, you see it comes out to $2,054,000. So what if you offered the same company a structured pilot, in other words, a pilot contract for 20 years with a stream of payments equal each year, the present value of which would be the same as what they would expect to get by going to the state and getting a 10-year ITEP. So this table illustrates if they made an annual payment of a little over $151,000 for 20 years, the present value of that stream of payments is the same as the present value of the ITEP scenario. So from the company's financial standpoint, these two scenarios from a present value position are the same. But look at the last two columns from the point of view of a local government that's getting $150,000 a year during this 10-year desert where under the ITEP they'd be getting nothing. Now admittedly that comes at the expense of revenues in the last 10 years, but it's a steady and it's a quantifiable stream of income that the taxing bodies can count on over this 20-year span. So this, from a financial standpoint of the company, these two scenarios are the same, yet from the local government point of view, the second one provides some additional benefits. So this is a possible way that local governments could approach a company and say, we would like for you to come here, we'd like to provide this incentive, but we would like you to consider this structured 20-year pilot as opposed to going to the state and getting a 10-year ITEP, because this way there's some benefits that come to the local governments. Another thing that's not really illustrated in this table, and it's true of all pilots, is that with the 10-year ITEP, this is done entirely through the state, through the stroke of a pen, through LED, the Board of Commerce and Industry. Local governments have no say-so in who gets these, what the criteria are, if they provide the number of jobs that they promise. I mean, there are even stories about companies that get a 10-year property exemption to install equipment that is replacing jobs, which doesn't seem like a very public-minded type of a goal. But if you have a pilot that's sponsored by a local government, you can attach some deliverables to that. You can say, look, you're promising, say, 200 more jobs for this expansion. Well, okay, we'll give you this pilot, but you have to provide the 200 jobs. And if you don't provide the 200 jobs, the reduction that we're approving for you gets cut back. If you're saving, say, $100,000 a year through our pilot, and you only provide 150 jobs instead of the 200 jobs you promise, so you're falling 25% under your goal, 25% of that benefit that you're getting, you may have to make that as an additional payment. That's one way to handle that. So you take the benefit that they're getting and tie it to some things like jobs, like using local companies as contractors and subcontractors, like hiring local workers for the construction of the project, like setting aside a certain amount of the contracts for minority or disadvantaged business enterprises. There are lots of ways that you can attach conditions to these pilots and have some control or enforcing what the companies are promising to do that you don't have with the state. So that's another advantage of doing pilots locally rather than through the state program, if that's something that can be negotiated between the company and the local governments. So those are two examples of how the pilots can kind of relate to the 10-year ITE program, the ITEP. Some others are a little more esoteric, not used as commonly, although some of them are getting more and more common. The next one, back on page 7, redirecting local tax revenues to finance necessary infrastructure and site improvements that are necessary to attract or retain the businesses that would otherwise be unaffordable. So take, for example, a company that wants to come build a big manufacturing plant on some undeveloped property in a remote part of the parish. And this property, say, is not connected to the local utility system. Or maybe it has only a residential water line running in front of it. And this plant needs a much bigger water supply. And the local utility simply doesn't have the money to run a huge water main for 5 miles to get to this plant. So how do you address this? Well, one way is to use the pilot. Basically, redirect the taxes that this company might have otherwise paid to all the taxing bodies as a contractual payment in lieu of taxes, and direct that money to the local utility so that they can afford to put in the water line that's necessary to make this plant happen. So there are two ways of doing it. Either the payment in lieu of tax can be made directly to the local government that owns the utility, and they can then bond that stream of income into a borrowing that allows them to install the infrastructure. Or the alternative would be the company itself pays for the infrastructure, the water main or the road improvements or the rail spur, and is reimbursed over a period of years through that pilot. So let's say it would cost $1 million to put in this infrastructure, and the company says, all right, let's negotiate a payment in lieu of tax that saves us $100,000 a year for 10 years. So we'll spend the $1 million up front, and we'll get that $1 million back in installments over 10 years by saving $100,000 a year on our property taxes. Now, the project gets done at no expense to the local government. The company essentially is paying for it, and they are reimbursed over a period of time through the use of this pilot. So this is another way. As you can see, it's not a pure incentive like the other examples. It has nothing to do with the ITE program, but it's a reimbursement type pilot. So those are two sort of variations of how a pilot can be used to get infrastructure to a site that otherwise wouldn't be suitable for whatever type of project that was coming in. And we've seen a lot of those, in fact, a growing number of those over the last few years for projects that are remote and need road improvements. Sometimes it's, as I said, would be like a water main. Sometimes the road that's in front of it's maybe a rural road and it's just inadequate for the additional traffic that's going to be on that road from employees, truck traffic, things like that. And so using the pilot is a way that what would have been a tax payment going to local taxing bodies can be redirected into these other type of infrastructure improvements. Yes.
You use this for retail projects as well, can't you?
Yes.
And I just want to point out this was used for traffic signals and roads for Whole Foods and Shreveport as well as the Kroger Marketplace shopping center. So it's not just confined to manufacturing and industrial.
Right, and that's, I should have mentioned that before. Another huge difference between pilots and the ITEP is the ITEP is just for manufacturing. Pilots can be used for any kind of commercial activity, whether it's manufacturing, warehousing, shopping centers, office buildings, and apartment buildings. We've seen all kinds of projects using pilots around the state, not just manufacturing. Two more things I want to cover really briefly because I don't want to run out of time. Second to last one, a vehicle for project developers to obtain certainty regarding amount of future property tax payments. This is particularly important. We're seeing a lot of these in the New Orleans area with respect to subsidized housing projects. So apartments that are being built with units that are set aside for low, moderate income residents. They may receive tax credits or other incentives. And there's a lot of controversy about what's the best way to assess properties that are benefiting from these other types of incentive programs, particularly housing that's subsidized, and so the income stream that a project like that can generate is restricted because of the rent restrictions that they have under their other incentives. Because of that, there sometimes ends up being some disagreement between the developers of properties and the local tax assessors about what the property taxes should be or will be on a property like this once it's placed in service. The developers, when they're looking to put together projects like this and secure their financing, need certainty as to what the tax payments are going to be. And so sometimes they feel as if they're not getting that certainty from the assessor's projections, or they feel as if the assessor's projections are too high and out of line with other comparable projects. I don't know enough about the ins and outs of how that's done really to talk too much about that, other than that it does seem to be a problem. And developers, this has been a special problem in New Orleans, where they end up having to go to the tax commission, fight the local tax assessor to get property tax assessments. It's a long, drawn-out process, and the problem is that if they use the higher projections that the assessor gives them, they often can't secure their financing. They can't meet the ratios they need to get their financing. But if they could simply lock in the amount of taxes that they think they really are going to end up paying with some certainty, then they can get their financing. Well, how can you lock in a tax payment that's going to be due 5 years from now when you don't know what the assessment's going to be, what the millage rate's going to be, and so forth? You can use a pilot. So if those developers can justify their projections, the local industrial boards can structure a pilot, giving them certainty over a period of 5 or 10 years of a payment in lieu of tax, so they're not exposed to the uncertainty of a tax bill. And that allows them to get their financing done because they have that line item now nailed down in their budget. So we see that as an important thing, particularly now in New Orleans, where affordable housing has become a priority of the city administration. They're looking for ways to encourage people to build affordable housing projects or developments, and having certainty as to the taxes through a pilot arrangement is one of the things that can help those types of arrangements get off the ground. So it's very important. And then the last thing I mentioned as a way for local governments to secure assurances about jobs, payroll, preference for local minority disadvantaged businesses. I mentioned that before. It's just being able to have clawbacks built into the pilot is a way that local governments can enforce and provide some accountability to the taxpayers that by providing this incentive that the community is really going to get the benefits that they're bargaining for. So there's one last thing I want to talk about before turning this over for the next part of the presentation, and that is a question that often comes up to people who are looking or thinking about pilots for the first time. They've heard all of this and they say, well, the pilot it's costing the taxing bodies money. I mean, we're reducing the tax bill. Why isn't this costing the taxing bodies money? And why don't the school boards and the parishes and the sheriffs and the cities and the fire districts have more to say about whether or not these pilots should be approved or not? Well, that's one of the things that the state has done, or the governor has done through his executive order, is to require a little more local involvement in the ITEP process, which is one of the reasons that the ITEP process has more or less ground to a halt. The way that I like to think about it, and the way I think that everybody should think about these pilots, is that the two alternatives when you're talking about pilots are not a project with a reduced pilot on the one hand versus a project paying the full amount of taxes on the other hand. If those were the two alternatives that you had to choose between, of course, you choose the project paying the full amount of taxes. The reality, though, is that the two alternatives are a project with a pilot or vacant property. Because if you buy the argument that the pilot is necessary as to make the project happen, then the alternatives are project with pilot or no project at all, and property that remains a parking lot or undeveloped property or farmland or a plant that goes away and jobs that disappear, or a plant that doesn't grow when it might otherwise be growing. So I think it's important to sort of retune your thinking to keep in mind that if you look at this, at the table on the page 8, and think about the first year when this property tax payer or this company is paying $37,500 instead of $375,000. This isn't the taxing bodies losing $330-something thousand a year in tax revenues. This is the taxing bodies getting an extra $37,000 or an extra, $37,500 minus the $5,000 they were already getting. This is the taxing bodies getting this much more than they would have otherwise, plus the jobs, plus, if it's the right kind of development, the sales taxes that result from the development, if only on the construction materials, plus the property taxes that will come on the rolls at the end of the 10 years. So don't think of the pilot as costing local government. Think of the pilot as a way that provides additional revenues to local governments eventually, and in the interim provides other benefits. And that's why you're doing the pilot, to bring in jobs, to retain jobs, to provide additional capital development, generate sales taxes in certain cases, provide affordable housing if that's a policy goal. It can be, all of these things are reasons to consider pilots. And so I would just urge you to not think about the pilot as an expense to local government, but think of the pilot as something that benefits local government. I don't want to take too much more time, but if you have any questions, I'll be happy to answer them either now or at the end of the next presentation. Yes?
What agencies have to be a part of the agreement of the local taxing? Does both the police jury and the city have to be a party to it?
By law, these pilots can be done strictly by contract between the company and, say, the Industrial Development Board. So in most cases, the pilot agreement itself is a document that's signed by, say, the local Industrial Development Board and the company. Now, behind that agreement there are varying degrees of involvement by the local taxing bodies. In New Orleans, for example, the local IDB works with the Mayor's Office of Economic Development to secure kind of the public blessing of the pilot structure. We don't talk to the school board, we don't talk to the sheriff or the levy board or the Audubon Zoo or anything like that. We just talk to the city. In Ouachita Parish, where we've just completed some pilots for the first time in many, many years, the company went to each taxing body, talked to them, explained what they wanted to do, and got a short letter of support. But those taxing bodies are not going to be a party to the contract, and they're not required to, because the tax exemption comes from the ownership, from the transfer of ownership into the Industrial Development Board. It doesn't require consent of the local taxing bodies the way the governor's executive order does now for the state ITEP.
So do cities and the parishes each have an IDB board, or is it just one IDB board?
It depends. In New Orleans, obviously there's no parish in New Orleans, so that's a bad example. In Caddo Parish, there's a Caddo Parish Industrial Development Board and a City of Shreveport Industrial Development Board. The City of Shreveport Board, to my knowledge, has only done 2 projects in its whole history. Most parishes that have a parish-wide industrial board don't also have city industrial boards. But you can have both with overlapping jurisdiction. They function exactly the same. It's just that in the parish case, in the case of a parish IDB, the police jury, the parish council appoints the members. In the case of a city IDB, the city council would appoint the members.
I was just wondering if a project was going to come into the city and you have to do a pilot program.
Mm-hmm.
You've got an IDB board that was set up by, say, the police jury, negotiating a pilot program inside the city.
That's right. That's true. But the development that's in the city is also in the parish, so it pays parish taxes, school board taxes. You know, not every parish has as complicated a school board situation as Ouachita does, or as complicated a taxing structure as Ouachita does. But you're right. There are overlapping jurisdictions. There can be political questions, but this is simply the way it works. Usually parishes operate with a single entity that sort of does all the economic development activities in that parish. Like in Jefferson Parish, there is an industrial development board. It's been inactive for many, many years. Now their pilots and other economic development activities are done through JEDCO, which is the Jefferson Economic Development. It's actually a port commission that was sort of broadened to include powers that IDBs have. Similarly, in St. Tammany, there's a parish-wide economic development district that functions in lieu of the local IDB. But yeah, you can have overlapping, but generally it's not a problem.
What about 501c6 organization that has some state appropriation but is not a state agency? Would it be vested with that authority, or is that a stretch?
I'm not familiar with those types of entities or them having ever been used, you know, for doing this type of entity. You know, nonprofits, some nonprofit corporations' property are exempt from local property tax by virtue of being nonprofit. But generally speaking, if the property is not related to their nonprofit purpose, it can't be exempt. So if local 501c3 hospital went out and tried to be an IDB, you would say, presumably, this isn't property related to your hospital business and therefore it's not exempt. You know, if Tulane, for example, owns apartment buildings that it rents not to students but just to the general public, that's not its nonprofit purpose. And so that property in theory shouldn't be exempt from property taxes. I won't say it's not, but and so I would think in the scenario that you raise that those would be the kind of issues that you'd have to address. I'm not familiar specifically with 501c6 organizations.
If a parish had one years ago, there's actually may still be some bonds kind of floating around.
An industrial board?
Yeah, industrial development board, and all of the members died, and
dormant.
been revoked by action.
Yeah, this happens all too often.
Can we get another one?
Yes. Usually all you have to do is file with the Secretary of State and get them current in Baton Rouge, and then have the police jury or the city council appoint new members. And, in the early 80s, we did industrial development boards in a lot of places because tax-exempt bonds were very popular. I remember creating an industrial development board in Union Parish that I think did one project in 1982 or 83. When those bonds were paid off, that project should have been sold back to the company that did it. It was a wood chip company. Whether that actually happened, I don't know. And occasionally a property turns up that's still in the name of an industrial board, even though the bonds were paid off many years ago. And we have to reconstitute the board to get somebody to sell the property back to the company. It's problematical. It doesn't happen too often. Because
I got one, I know, pending that happening, the bonds are about to be paid off in the Industrial Development Board.
Yeah. It only really matters if the Industrial Development Board owns that project in connection with those old bonds. Not all old bond issues involved a transfer of ownership. Some of them were done with a different structure that didn't require the IDB to take title, particularly if there was no sort of a pilot involved. So just because you have an old IDB and a bond issue that's about to pay off doesn't necessarily mean that there's a conveyance that will have to take place. But if that IDB owned that project and the bonds are about to be paid off, then somebody needs to attend to that and be sure that the property gets transferred back over. I just had a case in Shreveport where we discovered the bonds had been paid off maybe 15 years ago, and the property was still in the name of the industrial board. Somehow the assessor knew that and was sending a tax bill to the owners anyway. So they had been paying the taxes all these years, but we needed to get that cleaned up and transferred back into them because we didn't want the board owning property any longer than they needed to.
Oh, well, in this case, it is transferred to the Industrial Development.
Yeah.
So I may need to talk to you.
Okay.
You've been up there to talk with us before.
All right, great. Any other questions? All right, well, thank you very much.
Thank you so much, David. And David, thank you for the work you did here on behalf of the community with graphic packaging and DHL supply chain logistics. If you haven't noticed, Christine is beaming us up live on the Facebook Live, so if you want to go back and see any of this, it will be there. I've been doing economic development for over 20 years. When I started, I was skinny and I had hair, had bangs at that point. And I look at economic development, and Louisiana does it differently than Texas, and does it differently than Mississippi. And I see the pilot being one of the most useful tools in our toolbox. It gives a great deal of latitude to local governments and how they can structure the property taxes and other things that are associated with it. So there's a lot of latitude. You mentioned some other uses for pilots that maybe you haven't thought about. The Whole Foods store in Shreveport, you look at the street work and the traffic signals and all of those things related to that, all those public utilities, that was funded through a payment in lieu of taxes for that development. The same thing with the Kroger Marketplace development in LB Road and Fort North Luton. So it's not just confined to industrial and those type of projects. You could use it for a lot of things.
So in that example, did the developer pay for all of
The
that?
developer paid for it and then received a lesser tax bill through the payment in lieu of taxes scenario, and they took that and paid themselves back, if you will, for that initial investment. So that's what happened in that case. A couple reasons why I like pilots is I like local control, I like local government participation in it. It gives a lot of latitude as far as what local governments can do as far as terms. He mentioned that in response to a question, if the IDB had to get permission or approval by the local bodies, taxing bodies that were impacted by it, legally, they don't have to. Politically, and it just as a matter of good policy, they should. I know the Industrial Development Board that was set up here in Washington Parish, that's been one of the main things, is they want, before they're gonna look at anything, they're gonna want to know those local taxing bodies have been sometimes consider the public costs that are involved in educating kids in the school district and providing public services and all those costs that a city will have to take on with a project, or a school district, or a police jury, or a fire department, or sheriff. There are public costs involved with that. So it's not just gravy, it's not just revenue. We have to look at the big picture on these things. Mayor Mayo, it's good to see you join us. Thank you for joining us today. So what we did is, about a year ago, we saw the change that was happening in Baton Rouge, where it's really a paradigm shift, I think, happening at the state level, where you're seeing more local engagement as far as a requirement for doing economic development projects. So we started working with Impact Data Source to develop a cost-benefit model. So every millage in the 14 parishes we serve is entered into that. And we came up with a model that really gives a good quantitative value of a project. So we've used this for a project that we're working on in Natchitoches Parish, 1 or 2 in Caddo Parish. And for us, it gives us a way to really measure the worth of a project from a financial and economic perspective. So we have this tool in-house. We've used it a few times at this point and had good feedback from the elected officials that we worked with us on. Because what we want to do is, if we take something to a local government and ask for participation, we want them to be informed on what that project is all about as far as the cost and kind of the scope of the project. Something we also do that's not related to this is we're working a project, for instance, in Natchitoches Parish. That's a privately held company considering a move from out of state into Louisiana in Natchitoches Parish. What we did is we did this cost benefit analysis that Nicole's going to discuss with you, and she's going to actually walk through it with you. But we also, for that company, requested 3 years of audited financial statements. And what we did with that is we had a financial statement analysis done to see basically the financial health of the company. Looked at the same ratios that a financial institution would as far as debt to equity ratios. We even benchmarked it against industry peers, because I wanted to give those local officials in Natchitoches Parish as much information as I could so they could make an informed decision. We also do that for Caddo Parish. Caddo Parish has actually codified that as part of their economic development policy. So with that, Nicole Small, Austin. Who is a Longhorn?
I am, sir. Alrighty. It's a little fuzzy. I don't know if we can. Is there a button that's? I seem to be the source of technical difficulties today. I apologize. Scoot it up a little. Run over some cords. Seem to be getting better? No. Shall we move forward? I don't know. Whoop.
I'm not sure why it would do that.
Yeah, it was focused when first set up. Well, while she's kind of picking at that, see if we can get it anywhere. Again, I'm Nicole Small with Impact Data Source. We are a company that's been around for 20 plus years, working on 25 years. Jerry Walker started it. He's from Louisiana, and he in Texas connected projects. So we try to make it simple. Be careful on using jargon too much, things like that, and be able to give a number that you can provide the stakeholders in the end that really kind of says something. What I'm going to be going through at first is what we kind of consider some of the really important elements to a cost-benefit analysis. After that, I'm going to jump into Impact Dashboard, which is the model, and I'll walk through a scenario with you guys. You can see how that works. The slides that you have printed out in front of you, it's not all of them. It's just a couple of them with the kind of highlights. If y'all want copies of the slides, I'd be happy to send them to you. Just let me know. Just didn't want to waste paper. So we have these 7 key components. They're listed out right here. I'm not going to read through them on this right here. We're going to jump into them, start on the focus on your region. So it seems sort of obvious, but actually it can be a bit of a problem. It's, if you're a city and you're getting a report from a developer that's showing their impact, you want to be checking that and making sure it's specific to your community and not the statewide or something like that. The statewide's great for the state, but if you're representing the city or the parish, you really want to make sure that that's highlighting your community and the impact only to you. And so we'll dig in a moment to multipliers, and you're going to see how there's a big difference between what's happening to the city or the parish versus statewide, something like that. So economic impacts, it's this kind of broad term. What it kind of boils down to is anytime money changes hands, we're seeing economic impacts. So whether that's the company buying supplies from other companies, or that's the company paying their employees' salaries, or the employees using their salaries and purchasing within the community, this is all some variety of economic impact. They can all be calculated, and they kind of boil down to 4 different numbers. We don't really see them as all particularly equal. They can be some of them are a little more confusing, so we have a little bit of an opinion about that. I'm sure it's up for debate. But so we'll go through each one. Number 1 would be employment. Really simple. It's jobs. That's why we like it. It's easy to see. It's easy to calculate. It's easy to see if they've delivered on it. Very just simple. Also, household earnings. That's their salaries. It's also the profits of the business owners. And again, this is pretty easy to obtain this information, see what's actually happening, and kind of critique it. So we like those, number 1, number 2. After that, we have economic output. This is a really broad number that's basically saying what are the dollars that are being spent just throughout. And it can often be overstated because it's saying how much is the direct business spending, and then how much of the supporting business is spending, and it ends up overlapping. So you get these intermediate goods that are extra, and you're double counting things. So this is, can't really read it, but I'll tell you what it says. So we have an example of a multiplier for plastic materials and resin manufacturing. I get nervous saying is Ouachita Parish. Okay. So the multiplier is 2.4873. What that says is for every one direct job that's created, we subtract 1 from the 2.4873, and then we have 1.4872 of spin-off jobs. And that's only in the parish, and that's only in this multiplier specific to the industry. So we got to be really clear about that. And then comparatively, as I was saying earlier about making sure you're focusing on your community, So for sure with that, you want to take the whole picture and see what's going on. You might also want to look and see, well, but what's coming soon? Do we have nothing coming in for the first 10 years? That's important to know. So we do kind of want to keep our eyes on both sides of that. And then with that, as David spoke about, you might want to talk about present value. If this is a project that's going to stand out over 20 years, you want to see what do those dollars mean to you today, and check on that. If it's a shorter project or most of the money's coming up front, it's a little less important, but something to look into. The other thing that we think is really important that can be kind of overlooked is making sure that all the inputs and key assumptions are available to you and that they're being verified as either correct, or if you can't verify that they're absolutely correct, like we don't know specifically what the population is today. Are they reasonable? If you're pulling a population from 3 years ago, are we increasing it a little bit to account for what's changed in the last 3 years? You also want to check the project attributes. Is the jobs that they're claiming, are those reasonable? Are the salaries reasonable? And of course, tax structure too. You want to be checking on that. Are you divvying them up correctly? I know, as was kind of mentioned, here in Louisiana, the taxing structure was really complicated. I built the model. It was it took a little bit of effort to kind of tease out each piece. So that would be something to definitely keep an eye on. Last item is kind of fun one, incentives and being analyzed. So if you are going to be offering incentives, you got to put that in as either a reduction in your net benefits or a cost altogether. And so we also see projects coming in that might be receiving a pilot or some sort of abatement as not a cost. We see that as a reduction in your final end benefits, because there's this idea that the company probably wouldn't come all together if they're not getting that incentive. So tax-based incentives, those affect the net fiscal impact. And then the non-tax incentives we evaluate like investments. So you have the incentive, which is the investment. You have the net benefit, which is the return on investment. And then that results in a payback period and a rate of return that you can kind of use to see if those line up with what you feel comfortable with. Anything else I'm missing here? I don't think so. So this is the one-page report for our impact dashboard. And I just have on here, you have a copy of this in front of you so you can actually see it. I'm showing basically that we are hitting these 7 items. Even on just our one-page report, we're hitting all but one of them. And the other ones there, it's the assumptions I showed on the next slide here. If you're in our model, you can access all the assumptions we have in there. We don't include that on a one-page report. That would, everybody's eyes would cross and they'd hate it. So, but we do make sure we hit all those important features. I'm gonna jump in here to the dashboard specifically, so you can walk me through an example. And we are not looking at that. Let's close that one. Seeing it. we've had a lot of feedback over the years of what economic developers are really looking forward to present to their stakeholders, and we've constantly adapted what we're presenting, what our reports look like. I'll show you the reports here in just a second, and we have a one-page report that seems to be the favorite, which is it's kind of highlighting it. Doesn't get people too much into the weeds over, you know, all the calculations we've done. But we offer you those too, but then we have this one page that you can present and kind of show where it's at. And it's always, again, it's going to be consistent between each of your projects. You get to compare them kind of side by side and know that all the assumptions were equal and they're all being calculated the same, things like that. So this is our model. I've already jumped into a scenario for a project. We start here with this general info. Put in a scenario name, something simple you don't mind sharing with people, a description that might discuss how it adds to your community's overall goals. That's not just the numbers. You know, oh, well, we were really looking to fill some positions within a certain industry. This is hitting that. We like that. You might want to put that there. You here would select your parish. I don't know which city would. I'm just grabbing. I'm sure that. Oh, well, there you go. Perfect. You would grab your communities, your districts, and then here you can select your industry for your multipliers. Again, that's going to look different depending on which multiplier you pick. So this one's manufacturing for softwood veneer, and it's 2.103. This is the number for the parish. If we picked a different animal food manufacturer, it's 1.9. So you can see it changes a little bit. The idea is what is your community available to offer? How much is being outsourced? How much money is kind of bleeding out of the process? How much is being retained? And then we'll just continue on. We have all these inputs here we can fill in. So I've already put some in. We've got, I put 50 jobs in year 1, 50 in year 2. We could expand it to a 10-year analysis if we wanted to. And we have the ability to think about workers relocating. So this is animal food manufacturing. I'm assuming not many people would come from out of the community for those jobs. You might want to override this default and say, well, 15 might be standard for our community with our commuting patterns, but for this job, this project, let's put it at 10. And we put in our salaries. Again, maybe 50 is a little high for this particular industry. Maybe we say it's 30. And we've got this auto-calculating with a 2% increase every year. You can adjust that as well. Capital investment, I put in some values for buildings and then FF&E. Those will kind of run through for the tax dollars, and we can do those with an abatement or a pilot program. I also, I did put some in for inventories as well as building permits and fees. And as you put these in, things are adjusting over here. You're seeing the benefits, the costs, and then the net benefits. This is specific, I believe, to the parish, which tends to be kind of the primary district here. Then we can shoot over to public support. We can put in some property tax abatement. So I realize that that's maybe a bit of a misnomer in ways here with the pilot program, but it calculates the same way. So you can fill in here. We've got this table here that David provided, and it was showing kind of percentage paid. We would want to reverse that here and say the percentage that's being abated or reduced down. So I put it in at 75% for the first 4 years. And then we can scoot down, and we could put in a non-tax incentive. So again, this amount, because it's a tax abatement, it's reducing the net benefits versus this non-tax incentive, we're showing it as an investment, and you're going to be able to get this rate of return, payback period. You could do, I put in a total incentive amount. In the first year, you could do it on a per job basis. We have a few options here for that. You could pick a rate of return if you know you want to keep your rate of return at 20% or a payback period under 10 years, something like that. You could put that in and see what should be offered. So here we're seeing that it looks like about 3.8, 4 years is when you're going to be kind of breaking even and getting your money back. And so that can be really nice and valuable. And when we were talking about these programs where it was not receiving any money for the first 10 years, you're going to see that this gets drawn out, and it's a little scarier, it's a little riskier. You're not not being able to pay for the services to your community for that. So this is very descriptive of that. And then we've got our reports. This is the one-page summary that you had the slide for. It's showing just the high points of it, things you might want to present to these your stakeholders or officials. And then we also have a